Former Marine Sergeant Jake Morrison was sitting alone in his apartment at 2 a.m., holding the service pistol he had brought home from 3 tours in Afghanistan, preparing to end the psychological pain that had consumed his life since returning from combat zones, where he had lost too many friends to roadside bombs and sniper fire. His PTSD had progressively worsened despite therapy and medication, reaching a breaking point where the nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt made each day feel like an impossible burden that no one could understand or help him carry. Jake had written final letters to his family and made peace with his decision, believing that ending his life was the only way to stop the mental anguish that made normal civilian existence feel like a betrayal of the brothers he had left behind on foreign battlefields. But Sergeant, his specially trained PTSD service dog, who had been with him for 2 years, sensed the crisis developing and immediately activated intervention protocols that his training had prepared him for when veterans reached dangerous emotional states that threatened their survival. For the next 4 hours through the darkest period of Jake's life, Sergeant used every technique in his behavioral intervention toolkit to keep his veteran alive while alerting emergency services to a situation that required immediate professional mental health support. Welcome to Saved by Tales. Before we dive into this deeply personal story of invisible wounds meeting life-saving intervention and a service dog's determination to protect his veteran from the demons that traditional therapy couldn't always reach, join our community of animal hero enthusiasts who understand that some battles continue long after the war ends, and some heroes serve on the home front where their mission is saving lives, one crisis at a time. Jake Morrison had returned from his 3rd deployment in Afghanistan 18 months earlier, carrying invisible wounds that were more devastating than the shrapnel scars on his legs or the ringing in his ears from too many explosions. Jake seemed fine when he first came home, his sister Sarah Morrison often told friends. But PTSD doesn't show up on X-rays, and the Jake who came back wasn't the same person who had enlisted 5 years earlier. The nightmares came first, then the hypervigilance that made crowded places feel like combat zones, followed by depression so deep that simple tasks like grocery shopping or maintaining relationships became insurmountable challenges. Sergeant, a 3-year-old German Shepherd, had been specially trained as a PTSD service dog through a program that paired combat veterans with animals who could recognize and interrupt psychological crisis episodes before they became life-threatening. Sergeant isn't just Jake's companion, explained Dr. Lisa Chen, the VA psychologist who had recommended the service dog placement. He's a piece of specialized medical equipment that can detect emotional states and provide interventions that human supporters might not recognize in time. Jake's PTSD symptoms had been manageable with Sergeant's help for nearly 2 years, but recent triggers, including the anniversary of his unit's worst casualties and the suicide of a fellow veteran, had sent him into a downward spiral that challenged even his service dog's abilities. The bad days are getting worse and more frequent, Jake had confided to his VA counselor during their last session. Sometimes I feel like I'm back in that convoy, and I can't tell what's real anymore. Sergeant's training included recognition of escalating PTSD symptoms and intervention techniques that could help interrupt flashbacks, provide grounding during panic attacks, and alert others when Jake's condition required immediate support. But the German Shepherd had been detecting changes in Jake's behavior and scent markers that indicated his veteran was approaching a crisis state that exceeded the normal range of PTSD episodes they had managed together. Sergeant's been more protective lately, Sarah had observed during her last visit. He won't leave Jake's side, and he keeps doing that alert behavior where he stares at Jake and won't be distracted. Jake's decision to end his life came after a week of sleepless nights filled with combat memories and a growing conviction that his family would be better off without the burden of his psychological damage. I can't keep fighting this war inside my head, Jake said to himself as he sat in his apartment at 2 a.m. with his service pistol, the letters to his family completed, and his affairs arranged. Sergeant's response to Jake's crisis was immediate and professional, drawing on training that had prepared him to recognize when veterans were in immediate danger of self-harm and needed intervention that could prevent fatal decisions. The German Shepherd's first action was positioning himself directly between Jake and the weapon, using physical barriers and calm persistence that his training had taught him for exactly this type of emergency. "Move, Sergeant," Jake said gently, not wanting to involve his loyal companion in what he saw as a personal decision that would end his psychological suffering. Sergeant's refusal to move away from Jake activated the next level of his crisis intervention training, beginning systematic behaviors designed to interrupt suicidal ideation and provide emotional grounding that could help veterans reconsider fatal decisions. The German Shepherd began deep pressure therapy by leaning his full weight against Jake's legs, providing physical comfort that could help regulate emotional states during psychological crises. "Good boy, Sergeant," Jake whispered, but the dog's persistent positioning and alert behavior indicated that this was not a normal training exercise or comfort session. Sergeant's training included specific protocols for alerting emergency services when veterans reached crisis states that exceeded the service dog's ability to manage independently through standard behavioral interventions. The German Shepherd moved to the emergency alert device that Jake wore around his neck, designed to contact VA crisis counselors and emergency services when activated by either veteran or service dog. Sergeant's activation of Jake's emergency alert device triggered immediate response from the VA crisis line and local emergency services, but the German Shepherd continued his behavioral interventions while professional help was en route. "This is VA crisis response," came the voice through Jake's emergency communicator. "We're showing an alert from your service dog. Are you safe right now, Jake?" Jake's initial response was silence as he processed the reality that Sergeant had intervened in what he considered a private decision about ending his psychological pain. "Jake, this is Dr. Martinez from the crisis team," the voice continued. "Sergeant is trained to alert us when he detects you're in immediate danger. We have emergency responders heading to your location, but I want to talk with you right now." Sergeant maintained his protective positioning while the crisis counselor began the conversation that could help Jake reconsider his decision and accept professional support. Dr. Martinez's crisis intervention experience guided the conversation as Jake gradually began expressing the psychological pain that had brought him to the breaking point where ending his life seemed like the only solution. "The nightmares won't stop," Jake finally said. "I see their faces every night. Rodriguez, Patterson, Williams, all the guys we lost, and I'm still here. Why did I make it when they didn't?" Sergeant's presence provided grounding throughout the conversation as Dr. Martinez helped Jake understand that survivor's guilt was a symptom of his PTSD, not evidence that he didn't deserve to live. "Sergeant knows you're in pain," Dr. Martinez observed. "That's why he's intervening. He's been trained to recognize when veterans need help, and he's telling us that you're worth saving." The German Shepherd's continued behavioral interventions included retrieving comfort items and providing physical contact that helped regulate Jake's emotional state during the crisis counseling session. Emergency responders arrived at Jake's apartment within 20 minutes of Sergeant's alert, finding a veteran in crisis but alive and engaged in conversation with professional counselors who were providing immediate mental health support. "We're here to help, not to judge," EMT Jennifer Walsh said gently as she entered Jake's apartment with mental health crisis specialists. Sergeant did exactly what he was trained to do. Jake's initial resistance to emergency intervention gradually decreased as he recognized that the professional responders understood PTSD and treated his crisis as a medical emergency rather than a moral failure. "Sergeant saved my life," Jake admitted as crisis counselors prepared to transport him to the VA Medical Center for immediate psychiatric evaluation and treatment adjustment. The German Shepherd remained close to Jake throughout the emergency response, providing continued support while professional mental health teams took over the intervention that his alert had initiated. Jake's crisis intervention at the VA Medical Center included immediate psychiatric evaluation, medication adjustment, and enhanced therapy protocols designed to address the severe PTSD symptoms that had led to his suicidal ideation. Jake's service dog prevented what could have been a completed suicide, reported psychiatrist Dr. Robert Kim during Jake's initial assessment. Sergeant's training and intervention gave us the opportunity to provide enhanced treatment before Jake's crisis reached a fatal conclusion. Sergeant was allowed to remain with Jake throughout his psychiatric hospitalization, providing continued support and behavioral interventions that complemented professional mental health treatment. The crisis experience led to revised treatment approaches that incorporated Sergeant's observations and alerts as important indicators of Jake's psychological state and treatment effectiveness. "Sergeant monitors Jake's condition 24 hours a day," Dr. Kim noted. "His alerts provide early warning of developing crises that allow us to intervene before symptoms become life-threatening." Jake's recovery from his suicidal crisis was gradual and required intensive therapy, medication adjustments, and enhanced support systems that included both professional mental health services and Sergeant's continued behavioral interventions. "I'm grateful Sergeant didn't let me make that decision," Jake reflected during group therapy sessions. "I was in so much pain that I couldn't see any other options, but he knew I was worth saving even when I didn't." The crisis experience strengthened the bond between Jake and Sergeant while demonstrating the life-saving value of properly trained PTSD service dogs who could provide interventions that human supporters might not recognize or provide. Sergeant's behavior gradually returned to normal as Jake's psychological state stabilized, but the German Shepherd maintained enhanced vigilance that his training had taught him following crisis episodes. Jake's crisis brought his family together in ways that his previous struggles with PTSD hadn't achieved, creating understanding and support systems that enhanced his recovery and reduced his sense of isolation. "We didn't understand how bad Jake's PTSD had gotten," Sarah admitted during family therapy sessions. "Sergeant's intervention showed us that we needed to learn more about supporting veterans with invisible wounds." The family's education about PTSD and crisis recognition helped create a support network that complemented Sergeant's professional training and behavioral interventions. Jake's willingness to discuss his psychological struggles increased as he recognized that his crisis had demonstrated the importance of accepting help rather than fighting his battles alone. Jake's experience with Sergeant's life-saving intervention led him to become an advocate for PTSD service dog programs and veteran mental health awareness, sharing his story to help other veterans understand that seeking help was a sign of strength. "Sergeant saved my life by doing exactly what he was trained to do," Jake explained during speaking engagements at veteran organizations. "Service dogs can provide interventions that humans might miss, and they're available 24 hours a day when crisis strikes." The partnership between Jake and Sergeant was featured in PTSD education programs and service dog training curricula, highlighting the potential for specially trained animals to serve as life-saving resources for veterans. 3 years after Sergeant's crisis intervention, Jake continued his mental health treatment with enhanced stability and coping skills, supported by his service dog's ongoing behavioral monitoring and intervention capabilities. "Some days are still harder than others," Jake acknowledged during follow-up appointments. "But Sergeant helps me recognize when I'm struggling before it becomes a crisis, and I have support systems now that I didn't have before." The German Shepherd's role evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing psychological support, demonstrating the long-term value of PTSD service dog partnerships for veterans managing chronic mental health conditions. Jake and Sergeant's story contributed to expanded funding and recognition for PTSD service dog programs, helping more veterans access specially trained animals who could provide life-saving interventions during mental health crises. Jake's experience proves that PTSD service dogs can be the difference between life and death for veterans struggling with invisible wounds, said Program Coordinator Dr. Amanda Foster. Sergeant's intervention created the opportunity for professional treatment that saved Jake's life. The case was featured in veteran mental health education and policy discussions about innovative treatment approaches for PTSD and suicide prevention. Years later, Jake continued sharing his story and advocating for veteran mental health resources, with Sergeant remaining by his side as both service dog and symbol of hope for veterans facing similar psychological battles. "Sergeant didn't just save my life that night," Jake would tell audiences. "He gave me the chance to build a life worth living, and he continues to help me manage my PT every single day." Their partnership demonstrated that some battles require four-legged allies who never leave their posts and whose training can recognize when warriors need saving from wars that continue long after they come home. "I still think about that dark night when a decorated Marine sat alone with his service weapon, believing that ending his psychological pain was the only way to stop fighting a war that had followed him home from foreign battlefields, while his family slept peacefully, unaware that their hero was planning to become another veteran suicide statistic." If Sergeant had been just a pet instead of a professionally trained crisis interventionist, if he'd lacked the specialized training to recognize suicidal ideation, If he'd been anything less than a medical professional who understood that some battles require four-legged soldiers who refuse to let their warriors surrender to invisible enemies, Jake Morrison would have joined the 22 veterans who die by suicide every day while help remained unaware that intervention was desperately needed. Sergeant's story teaches us something profound about the invisible wounds that follow our veterans home and the specialized partnerships that can provide life-saving interventions when traditional support systems aren't enough to prevent tragic outcomes from PTSD. Battles that continue long after military service ends.